Imagine this, you said something at dinner, maybe you disagreed with your mom, maybe you made some decision that she didn't approve, or maybe you just simply forgot to call or do something that you wanted to do, and then she is there, physically present. She moves through the kitchen, she passes you in the hallway, but she's not looking at you, she's not speaking to you, the air is thick, and you don't understand what's going on, but you feel bad. You feel that you're being punished. And it is very disorienting because you are not sure what you've done. If that scenario feels familiar, if you grew up in a home where love could be switched off without any warning, this video is for you. Today we're going to talk about maternal silent treatment, what it actually is and what it does to us, what it does to our relationships as an adult, and most importantly, we'll talk about how healing begins. So stay with me. Also, I want to say that sometimes as a mother, I understand that you just can't. And I'll have a separate video for moms who feel that they really love their kids, but they just can't speak to them because kids did something horrible. So, the mother in this dynamic, when we're talking about silent treatment, she doesn't argue, she doesn't raise her voice, or she might raise her voice, but most likely she is not. She withdraws. She becomes quiet, distant. She takes on the posture of a woman who has been deeply, profoundly hurt. And the source of that hurt is her child, you. Withdrawal isn't brief. It might last hours, days, in some cases weeks. The longest I've heard was 2 months. And during that time, there's no conversation, no explanation, what went wrong. There's no opportunity to discuss, repair. There's silence, and it's very heavy. And you see that she's in pain. So this is what we call silent treatment. And when it occurs chronically in parent-child relationships, it's a form of emotional control. It works because children are wired to need their parents' emotional presence. So the absence of that presence doesn't feel neutral. It feels like rejection, danger, and loss of love. So the child, you, rushes to fill that void. You apologize, you shrink down until the silence literally lifts. And you learn slowly across years that this is the cost of having a self. Sometimes maybe you pretend that you're ill so that she stops being silent and talks to you. The silent treatment has a clinical kind of sibling, stonewalling. You may have heard this word in the context of couples therapy. Gottman's identified stonewalling as one of what they called the 4 horsemen of apocalypse, relationship breakdown. Alongside contempt, criticism, and defensiveness, stonewalling is one of the most reliable predictors of relationship failure. And stonewalling doesn't only happen between romantic partners. Clearly, it happens between parents, children, and when it does, the effects are not just interpersonal, but they affect children's development. So what exactly is stonewalling? It's the act of shutting down emotionally and communicatively during conflict or perceived conflict. The stonewaller doesn't engage, they go quiet, they look away, they leave the room, or they just give one-word answers. They make themselves a wall, which is impenetrable. They're not responding. And from the outside, it can look like calm or composure. Even sometimes you might feel that it's a mature choice not to escalate, but research tells us that people who stonewall, their heart rates are significantly elevated and bodies are in a state of psychological flooding. They're overwhelmed with stress. So that silence is not peace, it's shutdown. So now consider what happens to a child watching this stonewalling. She doesn't know about psychological flooding. She doesn't have a framework for what she's witnessing. What she knows is that the person she depends on most in the world has become totally unreachable. And the reason is something she did. She feels guilty. And when stonewalling is used by a mother as a response to conflict, it sends a message that becomes hardwired into the child's nervous system. Conflict is catastrophic. Disagreement means abandonment. When I'm too much, I totally lose connection. And here's why this is so damaging in relationships, not just in childhood, but across the entire life. Because healthy relationships require repair. There is conflict always, and they require the capacity to have a rupture, disagreement, misunderstanding, and then come back together. And the coming back together is in many ways more important than the rupture itself. So disconnection doesn't mean the relationship is over. We can hurt each other and still find our way back. So stonewalling interrupts this process entirely. There's no repair, only this gradual fall when the child apologizes, and it's not repair, it's submission. The result is an adult who is profoundly uncomfortable with conflict, who either avoids it at all costs, disappearing before it can land, or who escalates wildly because the stakes are survival. So you never learned that conflict can be survived. You were only ever taught that it ends in silence. We need to talk about a concept that most people haven't heard of, but that quietly shapes almost everything about how we experience love. It's called object constancy. So object constancy is the capacity to maintain a stable, continuous sense of another person, especially a loved one. Even when the person is absent, angry, stonewalls, gives silent treatment. So it sounds simple, but for young children, it's actually a developmental achievement. It's a skill that has to be built, and it's built through consistent, reliable relationships. Object constancy is developing early in childhood, between the ages of 2 and 5. And child gradually internalizes a stable inner representation of her primary caregiver. So the mother doesn't just exist when she is physically present, she becomes a felt presence inside the child. Secure base. So the child can carry that secure base with her even when the mother isn't in the room. Think of a toddler who's upset and frightened. Even if her mother isn't immediately visible, the child who has developed object constancy can soothe herself with the knowledge that her mother exists and her mother loves her and she will return and love her again and again. So she holds on to the image of a consistent, loving mother even when that mother is absent. So now ask yourself, what happens to this developmental process when the mother is physically present but emotionally absent? When she's there in the house, inaccessible, she's cold. The child cannot build a stable inner representation of a loving mother because the mother she experiences is not stable. She's warm one day and silent the next. She's affectionate until she isn't. She loves until the child does something wrong, and then that love disappears. So the message the child's developing mind receives is that love is not constant. Love is conditional. It can be here and then it's gone. And I cannot always tell when it will flip. So the consequences of impaired object constancy are that as an adult, a woman with underdeveloped object constancy struggles to hold on to the reality of relationship when she's not actively experiencing positive moments within it. When her partner is angry with her, even in a normal, ordinary way, she doesn't experience this as a temporary disruption. She experiences it as a possible end of everything. The love that was real this morning feels suddenly unreal. Maybe it was never real. Maybe it was always going to come to this. This is a learned template for how love works. It was installed very early, before you even had words to question it. And maybe you also struggle to self-soothe when you're in distress because you never developed that stable inner figure to turn to. The mother, who should have been internalized as a comforting presence, is unpredictable one, not reliable and unavailable. And perhaps most painfully, you struggle to trust in love that isn't being actively demonstrated. So you need constant reassurance, not because you're needy in a pathological sense, but because for you, love that is not visible doesn't feel like it exists. So you're still, in a way, that child in the silent house trying to locate your mother's warmth. Object constancy is closely related to splitting. If you've never heard this term before in this context, I want to take some time with it because once you understand it, you'll start to see it everywhere. And I have a few videos on splitting. So it's a defense mechanism, one of the earliest, most primitive psychological defenses that are available to the human mind. It works like this: rather than holding a person as a complex mixture of good and bad qualities that coexist in the same individual, the mind divides them completely good or completely bad, all nurturing or all threatening, the loving mother or the punishing monstrous mother. In very early childhood, it's developmentally normal. Young infants don't yet have the cognitive capacity to reconcile that the same person who feeds and soothes them is also the person who sometimes doesn't come immediately, who sometimes feels frustrated, distracted. So the mind keeps these images separate. The good mother and the bad mother exist as two distinct mental objects. As the child grows, ideally, she develops the capacity to integrate these images. She comes to understand that her mother is one person who can be both loving and imperfect, both warm and sometimes failing, full human being with all her own interior life. And this integration is what allows for nuanced emotional experience, the ability to love someone while also being angry at them, to disagree with someone while still trusting the relationship. And you can feel hurt without concluding that the relationship is over. Here's what happens when a mother uses chronic silence and withdrawal. This shift is too extreme and unpredictable. One moment the mother is warm, she's engaged, she's the good mother. Then something shifts, something that you may not even be able to identify, and suddenly she's cold and inaccessible. And the transition between these two states, there's no bridge, no transition, basically, no middle ground, just a switch that flips like Q. And the child developing mind cannot integrate these two versions of her mother because the mother herself seems unable to integrate them. She does not move through conflict and she does not return to warmth. She withdraws into a completely different relational mode, one that feels to the child like a completely different person. So splitting becomes a habit. As an adult, a woman who grew up with this pattern often finds herself in a mental world of extremes. Relationships are either wonderful or terrible. People are either trustworthy or completely unsafe. It might be that you yourself are either fine, acceptable, lovable, adequate, or deeply fundamentally wrong. You may notice that your feelings about people shift dramatically and suddenly. Someone you idolized can become someone you no longer trust at all. Maybe when you're doing well, you may feel genuinely good about yourself, but the moment you make a mistake, you disappoint someone or you sense disapproval, that good feeling collapses entirely. You don't feel like someone who made a mistake. You feel like someone who is a mistake. There's no integrated self, like one that can hold both your strengths and your failures. There is the acceptable self and the unacceptable self. And the unacceptable self, when it appears, feels like it's total, it's you, 100%. The silent treatment as a chronic parenting behavior is commonly associated with what researchers describe as narcissistic personality traits, a way of relating to the world in which one's own emotional needs are central, primary, and other people exist primarily in relation to those needs. For a mother with this relationship style, her daughter is not, in a deep felt sense, a fully separate person. She is an extension, narcissistic extension, a reflection, source of emotional supply the mother requires. What does that require from the daughter? Well, loyalty and admiration, of course, then agreement. The emotional work of making the mother feel seen, valued, central. When the daughter fails to provide this, when she disagrees, establishes a boundary, or just has a bad day, the mother experiences this as abandonment, as betrayal. She feels wounded. And the silence that follows is not simply coldness. It is from the mother's subjective experience, a response to pain that she feels. The mother is not performing hurt. She's feeling it in her way. The cause of that hurt places a burden on the daughter. In many of these families, there is a recurring sin. The mother has gone quiet, the house is tense, and then the father appears. His message, delivered gently, sometimes desperately, is some version of, just apologize to your mother. He means well in most cases. He wants the household to function again, and technically, he's right. An apology usually does fix things temporarily. Notice what this message teaches a daughter. It doesn't say, let's figure out what happened. It says, you need to be submissive. This pattern installs into a nervous system. There's this belief that the peace is only possible when you make yourself smaller. The father, in this role as peacekeeper, often reinforces the very dynamic that he's trying to soothe and change. So what does a child when warmth can be withdrawn at any moment and restored only when you apologize or submit? You'll learn that your feelings are not safe. Not because anyone tells you this directly, but because again and again your emotional expression, disagreement, desire for autonomy, your needs leads to punishment. And the message embedded in those repeated experiences is your inner world is dangerous. Your feelings cause harm to your mother. Your boundaries are acts of betrayal. And so you learn to manage, read the room before you speak, monitor your mother's mood very carefully, anticipating what might trigger the silence, and you're preemptively trying to smooth it over. You become hypervigilant to relational cues. Almost universally, daughters from this family struggle with a particular kind of guilt. A guilt that feels inexplicable and appears when you disagree with anyone in authority, when you set a limit, when you make a choice for yourself. The woman who grew up managing her mother's silence often finds herself managing the emotional weather of her adult relationships in exactly the same way. So maybe you're the one who apologizes first, even when you're not sure if you were wrong. You're the one who, when someone goes quiet or seems displeased, feels that old terror, that old urgency to fix it, that lurch, inside. What did I do? In romantic relationships, this can make you vulnerable to partners who withdraw affection as control, because you know this dance. Your body knows this dance. Even when you recognize it consciously, you pull to appease because it's impossible to resist it. And in your relationships with your mother, which often continues into adulthood, you may find yourself cycling through the same patterns decade after decade. The visit that starts warmly ends in silence. The phone call where she leaves feeling confused. Women spend years trying to finally earn their mother's sustained approval. The love you're reaching for is structurally conditioned in a way that makes it out of reach. The real healing begins with grief. Because before you can begin to reconstruct a healthy relationship with yourself, you have to grieve the relationship you did not have. The mother who wasn't emotionally safe. This grief is not a declaration that your mother is a villain, because most of these mothers are themselves wounded women, and they're carrying patterns that they inherited, and they're usually better than their mothers. So you are naming what happened without softening it. So it happened. Her silence was a punishment. You were made to feel responsible for her emotions. Your needs were often treated as betrayals, and that shaped you. And you did not deserve it. For many women, this statement feels almost unbearable to let in, because accepting it requires releasing the hope that if you had been better, it would have been different. It requires releasing the fantasy that there was some version of yourself that would have been enough. There wasn't, because the wound was never really about you. It was about a mother who didn't have the internal resources to hold another person's separateness without experiencing it as abandonment. That is a tragedy, but it's hers to carry. Give it back to her. It is not yours to carry. It is hers to carry. And then you start to locate the guilt. When you feel that familiar pull, the urge to apologize, to smooth things over, to make the silence stop, you learn to pause and ask yourself, is this guilt telling me something true? Did I actually harm someone? Or is this the old learned story that my needs are dangerous or that my limits are betrayal? Over time, with practice, you begin to distinguish between the two. Healing also means doing the slow, patient work of building object constancy with yourself. You need to learn to hold a continuous, stable sense of your own worth. One that doesn't collapse the moment someone displeased with you. One that doesn't swing from I'm fundamentally fine to I'm fundamentally wrong based on some conversation. This is not something that happens through insight. It happens through repeated experience. Relationships that stay stable even when conflict occurs. Therapist or friend who holds you warmly even when you're struggling. You are reparenting the part of you that never got to learn that love is constant. Healing the tendency towards splitting means learning to tolerate ambivalence, to stay with the discomfort of a relationship that is good and also frustrating, to hold the reality that someone can disappoint you and still love you. You can make a mistake and still be worthy of love and belonging. This is very difficult, I know, but it's learnable because your brain is plastic. The templates can be revised. This work requires time. Good therapist can help. It requires your own willingness to stay with the discomfort of change because it is difficult, because old patterns still feel safe. You don't do it alone, you don't do it quickly, but you can do it. I seriously, 100%. I've been working with people who did it, and you can 100% do this work. So silence can also be yours, not as a weapon, but as a container. A space in which you get to stop explaining yourself, stop apologizing for your existence, stop working to earn what should have simply been given. You are allowed to take up space, you're allowed to have needs, you're allowed to set limits, hold to them, even when someone you love responds with hurt or withdrawal. Because her pain at your boundaries is not proof that your boundaries are wrong. Your boundaries are your boundaries. The daughter who grew up apologizing for having a self can become a woman who knows in her bones that you are worthy of love, that doesn't require your diminishment, that love exists in friendship, partnerships, in the relationships that you build with yourself over time. You don't have to earn it. You just have to stop accepting substitutes. If this resonated with you, I hope you'll sit with it for a while. You don't have to have it all figured out clearly. You just have to be willing to start, and starting is enough. Take care.